Welcome back. All right, so several developments around the developing story this afternoon. The refusal of the former President Jacob Zuma to testify before the Zondo Commission and the results that have unfolded after all of that. Now, in the last half an hour here on Newsroom Channel 405, you've seen Edward Zuma give the Zuma family's first reaction to Zuma's stance and the reaction of the Zondo Commission. Edward Zuma telling our reporter in Nkandla, Bongodlulani, that he and his family would have to be killed before they would allow Zuma to be arrested and dragged to testify at the Zondo Commission. Then, representing a group of people who support both Zuma and the Secretary-General of the ANC, Ace Magashule, Carl Niehaus, the spokesperson of the Umkhonto weSizwe Military Veterans Association, representing a radical economic transformation group, in a live press conference now making certain claims about the way that Zuma has been treated. We'll fact-check some of those claims now with our senior political reporter, Zondo. Zondo, good afternoon to you. I suppose we need to start with this because it's been one of the main planks of Zuma's argument, which is that at the Zondo Commission, you do not have the right to refuse to answer questions, whereas in a court of law, you do. The argument from Carl Niehaus, I think Kibi Mapatswe has made a similar argument, I think Edward Zuma's made a similar argument, that Zuma's right to silence is being infringed.
Definitely, but the Constitutional Court spoke about this at length, and so did Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo. He spent quite some time speaking about the issue of privileges then as to when you are allowed to remain silent. In essence, though, the Constitutional Court said when it handed down its judgment that you have no right to remain silent unless you can justify, and you actually need to unpack how you would be incriminating yourself if you did answer a specific question. Now, this afternoon, when dealing with this particular issue, DCJ Zondo also dealt with it. He even spoke about a former SAA board chair, Dudumyeni, where he said that he's actually asked the legal team to go through the transcript, because that was the first time we saw that privilege being invoked at the commission, to go through the transcript of her testimony, and actually they're going to request her to come back to answer to specific questions related to Eskom. And the Deputy Chief Justice then used this example to say that the former president also, the same would apply. So he has no right to remain silent in this particular commission. And in fact, they are empowered by the Commissions Act to actually enforce this, but also now added to this, that recent Constitutional Court judgment.
Okay, I mean, there's certain things to look at here. I mean, Carl Niehaus making a point about the media being against Zuma, referring to a mistake that many people did make, I think including myself, to use the phrase generally corrupt in relation to the judgment by Judge Hilary Squires that found that Sheikh was guilty of corruption because, in a way, of his financial relationship with Zuma. The Constitutional Court, much later, of course, if I recall correctly, found that the benefit to Zuma was because of his political influence and Sheikh. Then we had a claim by Carl Niehaus around the Soros Foundation, saying that they were related, they were part of the protests, the sort of Zuma must fall or the Save SA protests. I mean, I'm getting a little old and grey, but I don't remember anything about the Soros Foundation at the time.
Not quite, and there has never really been evidence to substantiate this claim. I mean, this is the first time we heard from Carl Niehaus, but I don't remember this actually coming out. Of course, the argument you could make is that we are the ones showing you, leading the way, and actually telling you that these are the funders of that Save SA campaign, and that the Save SA campaign has not been consistent in dealing with issues, and that it was created around the downfall of former President Jacob Zuma. However, there isn't much evidence then to substantiate this particular claim when it comes to then those particular campaigns and protests that we saw in particular late 2017, early 2018, just before he actually resigned from office.
So we've obviously had all of this. This is the reaction to the Deputy Chief Justice's decision today around Zuma. But Zondo himself, how would you describe how he looked, what he was saying today?
I would describe Zondo as having a grim face, but stern, but quite emotional. I think at some points you could hear his voice breaking, and I think to a certain extent he's taken this matter personally, speaking about the fact that at the end of the day, I am the Deputy Chief Justice of this country. I've spent 24 years serving on the bench. I've taken many cases. Thousands of people have actually come before me. And so in a way, he was also trying to say I'm a legitimate being. And in response to those claims that have been said that those who sit in the Constitutional Court are not messiahs, to quote Edward Zuma quite succinctly. And if you listen then to what Zondo had to say, you could tell that this was not an easy decision for him to make, considering, you know, what we've heard, the likes of Carl Niehaus threatening civil unrest vis-a-vis, you know, what many have described as a possible constitutional crisis. But let's listen to what Zondo had to say earlier.
This is very serious because if it is allowed to prevail, there will be lawlessness and chaos in the courts, because there may be other people who will decide to follow his example when they are served with summonses and other court processes and decide that they can ignore them. Summonses and subpoenas get issued in our courts every day throughout the breadth and length of the country, in the magistrates' courts, in the high courts, and in other tribunals. And if the message that is sent out is that people can ignore or disregard or defy summonses and orders of courts that get issued by various courts every day in our country, and that they can defy those with impunity, there will be very little that will be left of our democracy.
The Deputy Chief Justice Raymond Zondo speaking at the Zondo Commission earlier today. And Zianda, we've become used to seeing him on our screens. We've become used to, I suppose, the Deputy Chief Justice's moods in a way, you know, sometimes laughing with the witness, sometimes being very kind and courteous, sometimes being angry and frustrated. But sorrowful is something we've never seen.
Not quite, actually, Stephen. And I think at some point it seemed as though the Deputy Chief Justice was going to start crying. I don't think I'm being dramatic when I describe, you know, the manner in which he was speaking. And he spent 30 minutes before he actually got to what the Commission intends to do about the failure of the former president to appear. He started off by really reflecting on what the Commission's legal head, Paul Pretorius, had outlined, that this is what they were actually planning to question the former president about. Then he spoke about the issues of privilege then that we've touched on a short while ago, related to this issue of whether or not he has the right to remain silent. But really, then the Deputy Chief Justice spending time to speak about the implications of the former president not appearing, the fact that there are witnesses who are expected to appear next week, and actually that this would really set a negative precedent. And to quote the Deputy Chief Justice, he said there'd be lawlessness and chaos. Let's listen into what he had to say.
The Commission will make an application to the Constitutional Court, which is the court that made the order that Mr. Zuma has defied, and seek an order that Mr. Zuma is guilty of contempt of court. And if the Constitutional Court reaches that conclusion, then it is in its discretion what to do. One of the things it can do is to impose a term of imprisonment on Mr. Zuma. Another would be for it to impose a fine. The Commission will approach the Constitutional Court and ask it to impose a term of imprisonment on Mr. Zuma if it finds that he is guilty of contempt of court.
Again, I'm afraid to say, sort of struck by the sorrowful nature, the tone of the Deputy Chief Justice in a way. Zondo Ngobo still with us. So the Deputy Chief Justice makes this point that if someone does not obey the courts, the rule of law, the Constitutional Court in this instance, does not agree to come and does not comply with the subpoena, there will be lawlessness. And in fact, President Cyril Ramaphosa made that same point, summing up the NEC meeting last night, the National Executive Committee of the ANC. In fact, I think he said, if I remember correctly, that this would open the doors to counter-revolution.
Absolutely, and I think what's significant about what's happened today is not only did the former president defy the Constitutional Court ruling, but he's also defied the ANC NEC, which he has privilege and access to as a former president. And it's telling then of the position that the former president is finding himself in, that some would argue that he's applying a scorched earth policy where everything will fall down with him, really. And in many aspects, so you could also say that this is also as a result of the vacuum that's been left within the ANC, because there are two dominant factions where neither one is more powerful over the other. And so in many ways you could say the former president is calling the bluff of the NEC. So what are you going to do then? There have been calls and opinion pieces written about the former president being kicked out of the ANC, having his membership suspended. None of that has happened. So in many ways I would say the former president is calling the bluff of the NEC, because ultimately he's defied them. I don't think it's the first time he's actually defied the NEC, to be quite frank, and nothing has happened. He's also not the first person in the ANC or a leader of seniority, such as the former president, to defy the NEC anyway, with very little consequence, or if any at all. So I think this is significant. It's telling then of the strength of the ANC, but also I think to a large extent the president, Cyril Ramaphosa, in his words and the things that he says and his ability to command certain power over people. They said that they would be approaching the former president, following on from Julius Malema and other leaders who've since tried to approach the former president. Evidently that has not worked. And so what does that tell us then about the ANC-NEC in its current form?
There's so many different implications, because, I mean, you can't really disentangle the one big dynamic around
Yes.
former President Zuma with the other big dynamic around Ace Makashule, the Secretary General, due to appear in court on Friday again. I mean, they're completely separate matters, and yet politically they're intensely related, it would seem, because generally speaking, if you support one, you support the other. If you oppose one, you oppose the other, right?
Absolutely, and they're really one thing. If you look at the language that they use, the tone that they use, the rhetoric that they use to defend the leaders, they both say that the courts have been highly politicized in the manner in which they approach these political matters, and there's been a lack of consistency in the manner in which certain rules, not only when it comes to the courts of law, but even when it comes to the ANC-NEC and its own guidelines and resolutions. When you look at the step-aside resolution, we'll know in about a month's time the finalization of those guidelines for stepping aside. But then, Stephen, the question becomes, will it be applied across the board without it being along factional lines? Because if that is the case, then what is to be of Premier David Makhura, some have argued? What is to be of Gauteng Education MEC Panyaza Lesufi? Because Bandile Masuku fell on his sword when it came to the issue of political oversight. And I think this issue of failing to conduct political oversight is also in and of itself going to become a political weapon used by those in the Zuma and Makashule camp.
Zondo Ngobo, thanks very much indeed. Really do appreciate it. All right, we're going to